On the morning of May 24th, 2024, a conservation biologist named Hugo Vercillo picked up his phone in northeastern Brazil and stared at a photograph that should not have existed. In it, two small blue parrots sat side by side on a branch of a Caatinga tree, being fed by their mother. They were wild-born. Their parents had been hatched in a facility near Berlin, Germany, reared in captivity, and never once touched a wild branch until they were released into a semi-arid landscape that had not seen a free-flying Spix's macaw in 22 years. Yet, there were their children, alive, eating, flying. The species in that photograph is called Cyanopsita spixii. The International Union for Conservation of Nature officially declared it extinct in the wild in 2019. Scientists had conducted years of surveys and found nothing. The last confirmed individual, a lone male, vanished from a dry riverbed in the state of Bahia in October of the year 2000. For over 2 decades, this bird existed only in cages, scattered across private collections and research facilities on multiple continents. And then in 2022, 20 captive-reared birds were flown back to the Caatinga and released. 2 years later, the species was breeding in the wild again for the first time in a generation. This is the story of how a bird officially declared gone was brought back. The science was extraordinary. The politics nearly undid everything. And the question of whether this ends in recovery or in a second extinction is still unanswered. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. The Spix's macaw is not a generalist. It cannot adapt to a suburb or a cornfield. It evolved inside one of the most specific ecological niches on the planet. The Caatinga, the name comes from the Tupi language. It means white forest. It covers nearly 10% of Brazil's territory, 900,000 square kilometers of semi-arid scrubland in the northeast, making it the only biome found exclusively within Brazilian borders. The Caatinga is thorny and pale and merciless. In the dry season, trees drop their leaves and the landscape turns grey and silver. Twisted trunks and bare branches press against a sky that reaches 37 degrees Celsius by midday. It does not look at first like a place where a rare and luminous blue parrot would make its home. But along the drainage basin of the Rio São Francisco, something different had always existed. Seasonal flooding allowed gallery forests to grow, ribbons of green cutting through the white scrubland, and in those gallery forests a tree called the Caraibeira towered above the rest. Its scientific name is Tabebuia aurea. Its hollow trunks and deep cavities created the only nesting sites the Spix's macaw would use. Year after year, the same pairs returned to the same hollows in the same ancient trees. The seeds of the surrounding vegetation fed the birds through every dry month and every wet season. Without the Caraibeira gallery forest, there was no Spix's macaw. The two were not simply connected, they were inseparable. This kind of tight ecological coupling is not unusual in evolutionary terms, but it carries a specific danger. Species that evolve in highly specialized niches develop dependencies that become liabilities the moment those niches are disturbed. The Caraibeira is a slow-growing tree. Its hollow cavities take decades to form. When those trees go, the nesting architecture of the entire species goes with them. There is no substitute. No adaptation can be made fast enough. The Spix's macaw was not a resilient bird. It was a precisely tuned instrument for a very particular habitat, and that precision, which made it exquisitely suited to the Caatinga, also made it catastrophically vulnerable to any disruption of it. When German naturalist Johann Baptist von Spix collected a specimen along the Rio São Francisco in 1819, he noted the bird was already rare. By that point, 100 years of burning, logging and overgrazing had already fragmented the gallery forest the macaw depended on. What followed was faster and more deliberate. Beginning in the 1960s, international demand for exotic parrots turned the Spix's macaw into a commodity. Collectors in Europe and North America paid enormous sums for a bird of this rarity and colour. Poachers raided nesting sites along the Rio São Francisco. Adults were trapped. Eggs and nestlings were pulled from Caraibeira hollows and smuggled abroad. Each raid did not just remove birds, it removed the ecological knowledge those birds carried, the memory of which trees were safe, which flight paths to use, how to read the shift between dry season and rain. There is a concept in conservation biology called cultural memory loss, and it applies here in ways that are not always discussed in the popular coverage of this story. Parrots are extraordinarily intelligent animals. They learn from one another. A young Spix's macaw did not inherit a map of the Caatinga encoded in its genes. It acquired one by watching older birds, by following experienced parents through the gallery forest, by learning which flowering plants were reliable in which months. When trappers removed adult birds from the wild, they were not simply reducing a head count. They were erasing accumulated behavioural knowledge that could not be reconstructed in a laboratory. Every generation of captive-reared Spix's macaws that followed was, in a very real sense, functionally illiterate in the landscape their species had shaped and been shaped by. The Reintroduction team would eventually have to reckon with this directly. By 1990, the entire wild population had collapsed to a single male, one bird. Alone on a fragment of gallery forest, keeping company with a female of an entirely different species. He persisted for 10 years. Then, in October of 2000, he was gone. The white forest had lost its bluebird, and the world for the most part did not notice. The birds that remained were scattered across multiple continents. Some were in private collections in Europe, some were held at the Al Wabra Wildlife Preservation Facility in Qatar, some were in Brazilian government programs. The disputes over ownership were fierce, and while institutions argued, the captive population was shrinking. A disease called proventricular dilatation disease attacks the nerves of a parrot's gastrointestinal tract and causes it to slowly waste away. By the early 2000s, no one had identified its cause. Roughly 70 Spix's macaws remained alive on the planet, and the number was falling. The situation was not simply grim. It was the kind of grim that has a name in population genetics, an extinction vortex. Small populations have reduced genetic diversity. Reduced genetic diversity weakens immune function, reproductive rates, and adaptability. Weakened reproduction reduces population size further. A smaller population loses more diversity. The spiral accelerates downward. The Spix's macaw was inside that spiral, and the wall at the bottom was visible. Then came the turning point. In 2008, researchers identified a novel virus behind the disease, a type of bornavirus. That identification made screening and management possible for the first time. Ornithologist Cromwell Purchase then joined the Al Wabra facility in Qatar, where more than 50 of the roughly 70 known birds were being kept, and began rebuilding the program from the genetic level up. Together with veterinarian Daniel Neumann, Purchase developed artificial insemination protocols specifically for the Spix's macaw. They spent hours watching female birds on video monitors, waiting for the exact moment an egg appeared, then racing from aviary to collect semen from genetically prioritized males. The goal was not simply to produce more birds, it was to produce genetically diverse birds. To pull the population back from the edge of the vortex by deliberately managing which individuals contributed to the next generation. In May of 2013, the first artificially inseminated Spix's macaw chicks hatched. Neumann described the result as what finally got the population out of the genetic bottleneck that had been closing around it for decades. A genetic bottleneck is not a metaphor. It is a measurable reduction in the number of distinct alleles present in a population. Once lost, those alleles cannot be recovered. Every chick that hatched from a genetically underrepresented lineage was a permanent addition to the species' resilience. Those chicks were not just numbers. They were insurance policies against future disease, climate pressure, and the unpredictable shocks that wild populations face. By 2020, the captive population had grown to over 170 individuals, held primarily at the facility of the Association for the Conservation of Threatened Parrots, a German non-profit based near Berlin. Under terms negotiated with the Brazilian government, the organisation agreed to repatriate birds for reintroduction. In March of 2020, 52 Spix's macaws were loaded onto a private jet and flown to northeastern Brazil. It was the first time any member of this species had touched Brazilian soil in over 3 decades. Thomas White, a wildlife biologist with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and a technical advisor to the project, described it as unique among all reintroduction programs because they were returning a species to a wild from which it had been completely absent for over 2 decades. In his words, there is nothing like it in the history of parrot conservation anywhere in the world. The birds arrived at a purpose-built release facility in the municipality of Curaçao, in the state of Bahia, the historical heart of the Spix's Macaws range. At the edge of an adjacent Carabeira gallery forest, a U-shaped flight and release module was constructed, 47 metres long, roughly the length of half a football field. In this enclosure, the captive reared birds were trained to fly longer distances than any cage had ever permitted. Their flight muscles had to be rebuilt, their cardiovascular systems had to be conditioned. A bird that has spent its life in an aviary is not physiologically prepared for the demands of open-air survival. The team understood that releasing an untrained bird into the Caatinga would be the equivalent of asking someone who has never left an apartment to run a marathon in the desert on day one. They were introduced to native food sources, Quixabeira, Caatingueira, Pereiro, the thorny, heat-adapted plants that define the Caatinga food web. Not in a generic way. Researchers had spent years before the release studying the behaviour of 123 birds at the German facility to identify the best candidates and optimise release protocols. They watched which individuals showed exploratory behaviour, which ones were socially dominant, which ones demonstrated foraging flexibility. These were not random selections, they were personnel decisions made on the basis of extensive behavioural data. But the researchers knew that ecological knowledge is social. A bird that has never seen a hawk shadow cross a clearing does not know to drop into the brush. A bird that has never heard the alarm calls of other species does not understand what those calls mean. The cognitive architecture for survival is present, but the learned content that fills it is absent. So the team implemented a strategy never before used with this species. 15 blue-winged macaws, a wild species native to the same region, were trapped, habituated to the release enclosure, and integrated into the Spix's training flocks. They would serve as mentors. The Spixes would watch them eat, watch them rest, and watch them respond to threats. They would, in effect, download from living birds the ecological knowledge that captive life had denied them. This was a gamble. No one knew if the Spix's macaws would pay attention to the blue-winged macaws. No one knew if interspecies behavioural transmission would function reliably enough to matter. The science said it should work. The science had also said many other things about this species that turned out to be wrong in both directions. The team proceeded anyway because the alternative was releasing birds that were ecologically blind and hoping for the best. On June 11th, 2022, the cage opened. 8 Spix's macaws flew out into the heat of the Caatinga, flanked by 8 blue-winged macaws. The monitoring team tracked every bird by radio telemetry, 3 checks per day, every day. Residents of Curaçao and surrounding villages were woven into the network as well. Farmers and neighbours who had never seen a Spix's macaw in the wild learned to identify its call and its shape against the sky, and began reporting sightings to the research team. When birds wandered, the community usually found them first. What happened next in those early weeks was not what anyone expected. The released birds did not disperse chaotically, they cohered, they moved as a unit. The blue-winged macaw mentors led them to food sources and water. They roosted together in the gallery forest canopy. When a bird of prey appeared overhead, the blue-wingeds dropped, and the Spixes dropped with them. The cultural transmission was working. Not perfectly, and not without losses, but it was working. The gamble was paying off in real time, and the monitoring team was recording data that would become one of the most closely analysed first-year reintroduction datasets in conservation history. A second release followed on December 10th of 2022. 12 more Spix's macaws, 7 more blue-winged macaws. 20 birds in total had now been returned to the wild. The research team had set their threshold carefully. Based on the history of parrot reintroductions worldwide, they decided that anything above 30% first-year survival would be considered a success. The models were not encouraging. One pre-release estimate suggested at least a third of the birds would be lost in year one. If losses were too severe, the survivors would be pulled back into captivity. Here is the key insight that changed everything. The data refused to fit the models. After the first full year of monitoring, the team published its findings in the peer-reviewed journal Diversity. First-year survival was 58.3%. Nearly twice the threshold researchers had defined as acceptable. 85% of the released birds exhibited flock cohesion. 65% established stable activity areas within 5 kilometers of the release site, staying close to the gallery forest and the Caribera nesting trees. Multiple heterosexual pairs formed. 3 females laid and incubated eggs. 1 pair successfully hatched and reared chicks inside an artificial nest cavity near the release site. Thomas White, co-author of that study, told journalists that the team had a wish list going into the program. Every item on it had been ticked. He added that they were pretty sure they would see good survival and good flock cohesion and good interaction among the birds. What surprised them was how soon the released macaws started breeding. Let me put that in context. In other parrot reintroductions worldwide, breeding behaviour in newly released birds typically requires multiple seasons to appear. It did not take multiple seasons here. It took months. Scientists expected modest social reorganisation. What they found was a functioning reproductive pair in their first year. 2 nestlings hatched in late October of 2023, the first Spix's Macaw chicks born in the wild in over 30 years. One died before fledging. The second left the nest on November the 8th, 2023. It was found dead 9 days later. The loss was devastating, but the cycle had restarted. Something important should be said about that first chick. Its brief life mattered, not because it survived, because it did not, but because its existence proved that the reproductive machinery of the species was functional in the wild. Captive breeding preserves genetics, but it cannot verify that wild reproduction will actually occur. The pair that incubated that egg sat on it through the Caatinga heat and fed the hatchling that emerged, did all of that in a landscape their lineage had not occupied in a generation. They did it without a template. They followed instincts that hundreds of thousands of years of evolution had written into them, and those instincts were intact. That is not a small thing. That is the whole argument for why reintroduction is worth doing at all. In March of 2024, 3 more wild chicks were born. 2 survived unfledged. And on May 24th, 2024, Ugo Verchillo looked at his phone and saw them perched in a Caatinga tree being fed by their mother in the dry forest of Bahia. He said that morning he woke up to a photo of the chicks on top of a Caatinga tree playing with their mother and being fed by her. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when you remove the pressure that broke a system and give the system time to remember what it knew. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation. A single Spix's macaw in the illegal pet trade was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors who prized it precisely because there were so few left. The rarity was the value. The extinction was the sales pitch. Every bird that disappeared from the wild made the ones in cages more desirable, which increased the incentive to trap more, which made extinction more likely, which increased the value further. It was a feedback loop built on the demolition of a species. The people who reached into the Caribera hollows and pulled out nestlings were poor. The people who paid for the results lived in climate-controlled apartments in Zurich and Osaka and Houston. That asymmetry was never seriously addressed. The captive breeding program that produced these reintroduction birds cost decades of international collaboration, private jet transport, and specialised facilities on 2 continents. But a wild, self-sustaining population of Spix's macaws costs its hosts nothing but the protection of the gallery forests they depend on. The pair that bred in their first year wild did not need an aviary. They needed a hollow in an ancient tree. Nature provided that at no charge. The expensive phase is the rescue. The sustainable phase, if you can reach it, is essentially free. But this channel does not tell half stories. And what comes next is not simple. Without annual releases of captive bred birds into the wild, the probability of the wild population going extinct is 100%. 6 different population viability models, published in Bird Conservation International in 2024 by researchers including Ugo Verschilo and Cromwell Purchase, all reach the same conclusion. Annual releases of at least 20 individuals are necessary for long-term viability. The wild population is too small to be self-sustaining at its current size. It needs reinforcement. Every year without a release is a year the probability of persistence decreases. The mathematics here are not ambiguous. They are not a matter of scientific debate. Every model run independently with different assumptions and different parameters arrives at the same answer. But in 2023 there were no releases. In 2024 there were none either. The reason is political. In 2023, the Association for the Conservation of Threatened Parrots transferred 26 Spix's macaws and 4 Lear's macaws to a private zoo in India, without the Brazilian government's knowledge. The Lear's macaw is also a critically endangered species found exclusively in Brazil, and its transfer without authorization was not simply a procedural lapse. It was a violation of the terms under which the Brazilian government had agreed to collaborate on the Reintroduction program, and more broadly, a violation of the trust that any international conservation partnership depends on. The Brazilian Federal Environmental Agency terminated its cooperation agreement with the organisation in June of 2024. The Spix's Macaw Action Plan concluded the following month. Wild releases were suspended indefinitely. It is difficult to overstate how counterproductive this is. The organisation that holds the world's largest captive population of the species central to a reintroduction program agreed to be necessary by the science, and that organisation made a unilateral decision that collapsed the legal framework of that program. The birds in the wild had nothing to do with that decision. They were simply its consequence. A dispute between institutions on different continents became, in practical terms, a death sentence for the fragile wild population in Bahia. That is what institutional failure looks like when the stakes are this high. It does not look like a disaster. It looks like a press release and a terminated agreement. The birds don't read press releases. By mid-2024, 11 of the 20 released birds had been lost. 6 confirmed dead, 4 from birds of prey, 1 from a wild or feral cat, 1 from electrocution on a power line. 4 others disappeared after long-distance flights beyond the monitoring area. The remaining birds were living within 5 kilometers of the release facility. That is not yet a self-sustaining wild population. That is a fragile remnant. Cromwell Purchase monitors those birds alongside his partner Candice Purchase, checking telemetry locations 3 times a day, every day. He can identify bird number 17 by the smoothness of its feathers and knows number 16 from number 22 by the beads on its collar. These are not abstractions. They are the only wild Spix's macaws on the planet. In his own words, the animals are adapted to harsh environments, but they are on the edge. Any small increment of change will decimate populations. That is not rhetorical. That is an operational warning from the person with the most direct knowledge of the current situation. He is not speculating, he is watching every day, 3 times. That warning reaches beyond predation. The region where these birds were released has been officially designated as Brazil's first arid climate region. The Caatinga is drying. The brief rainy season that allows the gallery forest to regenerate is becoming shorter and less reliable. Rainfall data from the past 3 decades shows a measurable trend toward longer dry periods and reduced total annual precipitation in the northeastern interior. The species survived thousands of years in this landscape, but it evolved in a version of it that can no longer be assumed to continue as it was. The caraibeira, which requires seasonal flooding to regenerate and to produce the fruit that feeds the macaw through the dry months, is itself under pressure. Reduced rainfall means reduced flooding along the gallery forest corridors. Reduced flooding means reduced Caribera recruitment. A forest that cannot replace its oldest trees is a forest in slow decline. The Spix's Macaw returned to a Caatinga that is not the same Caatinga it left. Some of that difference is manageable, some of it may not be. Protecting a gallery forest corridor from agriculture solves one problem. It does not solve the problem of declining rainfall. These are separate fronts, and success on one does not guarantee success on the other. The human dimension of this tension is equally real. 26 million people live inside the Caatinga biome. The communities of Curaçao, who became the Macaw's first response monitoring network and who learned to recognise a bird that had been absent from their landscape for over 2 decades, are among the most economically vulnerable people in Brazil. Their livelihoods often depend on livestock farming that competes directly with the gallery forest restoration the Spix's Macaw requires. A restoration target of 15,000 hectares of riparian forest cannot be achieved without the communities that live inside it having a stake in the outcome. The people in that landscape deserve more than a bird recovery program that succeeds at their expense. They deserve to be part of the economy that a recovered Caatinga could generate. Ecotourism, if managed well, creates local employment and gives landowners a financial incentive to maintain habitat rather than clear it. Payment for ecosystem services, where governments compensate landowners for protecting riparian corridors, has shown results in other Brazilian biomes. None of these mechanisms will work perfectly in the Caatinga. All of them are worth trying at a scale the situation demands. The macaw cannot survive if the communities it lives among have no reason to protect it, and those communities will not protect it out of sentiment alone, not when a cleared field is the difference between feeding a family and going hungry. This is not a cynical observation, it is an accurate one. This is not romantic nature worship. This is hard-nosed ecology colliding with hard-nosed political dysfunction and the economic pressures of life in a semi-arid region. The macaw came back from extinction. The program that brought it back has been stalled. And the science is unambiguous. Without continued releases, the bird will disappear from the wild again. Not in a century, in years. The clock on this is not slow. The wild population is insufficient to sustain itself. It needs more birds regularly. Every breeding season that passes without new releases is a season in which natural mortality reduces the already small number of breeding adults, and in which the probability of losing the entire wild population to a single catastrophic event, a disease outbreak, a severe drought, a predator surge, increases. The margin for error is nearly zero. What makes this particularly painful is that the birds themselves have done everything right. They survived, they cohered, they formed pairs, they bred, they raised chicks to fledging. They did all of this in a landscape their species had not occupied in over 2 decades, demonstrating an adaptability no model had predicted. The failure point in this story is not the birds. It is the institutions and the political systems that govern them. Go back to the photograph from May 24th, 2024, 2 wild fledglings on a Caatinga branch. Their parents were born in Germany. Their grandparents were kept alive through artificial insemination in Qatar. The chain that connected those chicks to survival ran through 2 decades of work across 5 continents, through a private jet cargo hold, through a U-shaped aviary 47 metres long at the edge of a gallery forest in Bahia, and through farmers in Curaçao who learned to look up at the sky for a bluebird that had been absent from their world since before many of them were born. That chain held. The chicks flew. What those 2 birds represent is evidence that a species declared officially extinct in the wild can come back, breed, and begin the long work of restoring itself to a place it once shaped and was shaped by. And it is a demonstration of exactly how fragile that return is and how much further there is to go. The existence of those chicks is a proof of concept. It is not a resolution. Conservation science has a tendency to celebrate its victories in ways that allow attention to move on before the victory is secured. The discovery of those first wild-born chicks generated international coverage. The photograph from 2024 circulated widely. People felt good shared the story, and moved on because the story had the shape of a happy ending. And the human mind, confronted with a happy ending, tends to stop watching. But Cromwell Purchas did not stop watching. He checked telemetry 3 times a day, he recognised each bird by the texture of its feathers and the beads on its collar. And he kept saying the same thing to anyone who would listen: the animals are on the edge. Any small increment of change will decimate populations. That sentence is not a warning about what might happen in the future. It is a description of what is happening right now on a monitoring spreadsheet in Bahia, updated 3 times daily by people whose job it is to know. The story of the Spix's Macaw is still being written in the Caatinga. The wild is waiting for more birds. The birds are waiting for a political decision that has not been made. And almost nobody outside the scientific community is watching. What surprised you most about this story? Was it the breeding in the first year, the fledglings in 2024, or the political suspension that put the whole programme at risk? Leave your answer in the comments below. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.